lots of these studies are done in a lab setting, and lab settings are not typical of the natural environment, and therefore might bring out behaviours in animals that aren't necessarily true of their natural behaviours, which may limit the generalizability of what you found. And this is true of human beings as well. I mean, it's a flaw of a study if it's a lab experiment, because if a human being is brought into a lab, you're not necessarily going to act in exactly the same way as you might normally in the world.
This was a problem, and I'm sure you encountered it as well, that I had when dating a psychologist while at university. And she said that when she was working, so obviously if you're a psychology student, you have to take a certain amount of studies for credit as part of your module. So
of course,
I
did it.
People to participate in their studies, so the entire department helps each other. And a lot of the time, because you're only recruiting from psychology students, because just getting the message out to non-psychology students is hard enough, but the department doesn't always have the budget to try and bribe them with Amazon vouchers or something. Mm-hmm. When you are having psychology students sitting in the chair and doing a lab study, obviously the student is drawing upon whatever they've learned in the lectures and are trying to accidentally work out what the purpose of the study is.
I've worked out many studies before.
That can prejudice the results.
Just by being well read, you can already know. Like I treated it as a bit of a game of guessing the title of the research to the experimenter before the experiment's over. And I said, is your study titled blah, 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 blah? And they're like, yeah, that's what we're going to call it.
Yeah.
Particularly the ones that relied on deception. Sometimes you'd have studies where they were just upfront, like, this is what we're going to do, because it's like cognitive functions where no matter how aware you are of it, it's just testing your ability. So awareness or not is inconsequential, but sometimes awareness is important. So it's very contingent on the experiment at hand, whether the environment affects it. Like I conducted, for my master's dissertation, I designed a computer-based experiment to get replies off of people because it was decision-making, so you didn't need them there in person. But I thought one of the advantages of it was that I asked people when they were at home on their laptop, which you would presume that most people responding would probably be very familiar with, and therefore the thoughts and behaviours that they would normally enact would be very salient when doing this activity in the experiment, because of course this is somewhere where they're going to make decisions maybe about purchasing things because they're buying stuff online. Therefore, you can justify it as being, okay, well, they're completing the experiment in an environment where they're used to actually making real world decisions. Therefore, it's a lot more applicable to my experiment than it would be if I brought them into a lab and gave them, a piece of paper to fill out. It'd feel more like test conditions, which, by the way, as someone who's been in part of many psychological experiments as well as conducted them, you kind of feel under pressure. Like, I think especially if you're a psychologist participating in a psychology study, you don't want to screw it up for the other person. It's kind of like an unspoken etiquette that, I don't want to make this person have bad results, so I'm really going to try to do it well, which also might affect things because you care more and you're going to score probably higher if it's a test of competence because you're applying yourself, even though it might be quite boring to other people.
Don't be ashamed, Josh. Pretty much every man's had performance anxiety at some point.
Well, my anxiety is that I'm performing too well, so there we go.
I too am a Giga Chad.
And the final kind of negative effect of using rodents is that there is genetic variability. Believe it or not, they're not all clones, and it means that certain traits and behaviours and certain genes and understanding how they work may be made a bit more complicated by the fact that people are using different suppliers for their mice and rats. And I know that there is a problem of actually people using too many of the same, and the same rats or mice being used universally might mean that there are findings that are perhaps not as applicable in other areas than we might think. And actually, I came across this in a sort of extract from Joe Rogan's podcast with Brett Weinstein titled The Problem with America's Lab Mice and Why It Should Matter to You. And he discusses how the lab mice widely available in America largely come from one supplier. And this is a problem because they're fairly unique from the wild population in that they have longer telomeres than regular mice. And the telomeres are basically the things at the end of your DNA strands. And having it's more technically, it's a region of repetitive DNA sequence at the end of a chromosome. I don't know too much about this beyond the sort of applications in psychology, so I'm not going to go into that side of it, but supposedly having these extended telomeres gives the organism an enhanced ability to regenerate cells, but also makes them more susceptible to cancer. But if you're thinking from an animal testing point of view, well, if they've got an enhanced ability to regenerate cells at the cost of being susceptible to cancer, doesn't that mean that, well, they're probably not going to live long enough to get the cancer in the first place because they're a lab rat, they have a set amount of time to be tested. But their ability to regenerate cells is important, because if you're testing a product that kills cells, then it's going to be seen as being safer than it truly is, in that you don't want a product that kills human cells, because that's bad for you, believe it or not. But yes, this seems to be a large problem that Brett seems to have come up with and no one's addressed. And I thought it was interesting here, and I wanted to make mention of it, because these sorts of things wouldn't even occur to someone who doesn't work in the sort of academic sphere, in the research sphere, because you don't know what sort of thing you're looking for that might affect and bias your results in the end. And I'm of the opinion that a lot of research is so unbelievably complicated that we need to be very, very hesitant before we can say we've got any concrete conclusions. I try and approach everything with epistemic skepticism, and I'm almost of the opinion that you can have a hierarchy of truth where you can say some things are more true than others, but you can never say something is absolutely 100% for certain. Yet you see it every day, all the time, and it kind of makes me despair at the state of humanity, because I'm so uncertain about everything all the time, because I know how complicated these systems are, because I've tried to study things. So I know that, yes, there are so many things beyond your comprehension as an individual that it's almost impossible to understand the world. And yet, such certainty all around the world. But
I mean, there are obviously some things that we can know and don't require the citation of a study to do, see modern transactivism. But I take your point perfectly.
I'm not saying you disregard common sense and things like that, but you can still have a working knowledge of the truth, and it still should be enough, because even if you're uncertain about everything, you've still got to do things that require some knowledge. So it's not just like, yes, I know nothing, therefore I'm not going to do anything. That's not a constructive way to approach it.
You should be receptive to new information, but operate off of common sense, because otherwise you're just going to get paralyzed by analysis.
Yes. So before I get into Calhoun's work, what's your impression of using rodents as test subjects? Because, of course, I've covered some of the positives, some of the negatives. What do you think is the summation of these as test subjects?
I can think of one limitation right off the bat, particularly in the drawing of parallels to human civilization that we're undoubtedly going to do with this. And that is, if there is limited genetic diversity among the rodent population, it probably won't match up specifically to the mouse utopia in the same way as it will with modern cosmopolitan cities, because there is a lot of genetic plus cultural diversity among human beings, and mice can't even develop culture because they don't have that level of cognition. So there are more than one factor. In this, it seems to be the purely material, versus in human civilizations, it is also the genetic and the cultural.
And the genetic side of things is important, because I think in one of Calhoun's studies, he used just, I think it might be Universe 25, the pièce de résistance of the whole thing. He only used 5 breeding pairs. So, of course, animals in the wild and human beings interact with those who are genetically similar to them in a far more favourable way than those who are genetically dissimilar to them.
Yeah.
And you generally get very robust findings of, even if the person isn't aware of how genetically similar they are to them, it's almost like an unconscious thing. I think there is a host of different things, both sensory and I forgot what the other one is. But basically you have this sort of unconscious knowledge that someone is genetically similar to you, and therefore you treat them more favourably. This, of course, is true of kin selection, and there's a lot of talk in evolutionary biology in particular about why animals act altruistically towards their kin. Perhaps it could even be, say, a cousin or a nephew like that, where there's not a direct lineage, either paternal or child. So to understand that, you've got to look at things from the gene's eye point of view, which is actually what Richard Dawkins did in The Selfish Gene. And I think that's actually the best way to look at how organisms interact with one another, is from the gene's point of view, because when you look at it from that perspective, then it all starts to make sense. Families make sense. Why people see their family unit as a sort of self-contained thing separate to everything else, well, because it's the genes, isn't it? As well as why you have these consistent in-group preferences within certain ethnic groups, is that there's genetic similarity, and therefore people you share genes with, you want to succeed more, because then it propagates your genes and you become more evolutionarily successful.
And also, it's not something that we can necessarily replicate, that homogeneity with the similar conditions to the mouse utopia, because as soon as cities exist, they are draws for the artisans and the outcasts and the guild members, and they have, especially since the expansion of larger industrialized cities, have been draws for mass migration and commerce. So we don't really have a model for a very homogeneous city and what the conditions would be on human behavior, because most of the time you have that underlying anxiety of interacting with more people than you usually would, as you spoke about in your prior contemplations, and people who are very dissimilar to you visually and culturally. That's just another background pressure.
So yes, if anything, there is more of an expectation for disharmony in human cities than there are in the mouse utopia, because
that's really worrying.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.